America is on fire, both metaphorically and in many places, literally. Protests have erupted in up to 75 cities across the United States. As of making this video, as many as 25 cities across 16 states have imposed curfews. The unrest is widespread and intense. An economic collapse seeing 1 in 4 Americans claiming unemployment benefits, coupled with long-term intense race relations, have led to an atmosphere of wide-scale discontent. The murder of George Floyd would be the catalyst to ignite the present flames. On Monday, the 25th of May, Minneapolis police would get a call from a grocery store stating that a man had paid with a counterfeit $20 note. In turn, officers would arrive on scene and attempt to put George Floyd in the back of a police vehicle. Police officer Derek Chauvin would restrain George by placing his knee on the back of his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George would become unresponsive, becoming pronounced as dead upon arrival at hospital. Derek Chauvin would be charged with third-degree murder. However, for many this was simply not enough, leading to an escalation of many protests into riots on Friday and Saturday. This unrest is as intense as the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. For many Americans, the murder of George Floyd is representative of a wider systemic issue. For them, over the last 50 years, little has changed since LBJ would set up the Kerner Commission, which documented police brutality. Further, the coronavirus pandemic has seemingly only exacerbated these existing issues, seeing African Americans being disproportionately represented in the deaths of coronavirus while also being hardest hit by the economic collapse. The fact that predictions of unemployment are expected to rise as high as 20% places America in dire straits. The question is, though, is whether these dispersed protests will lead to something else, a revolution. This video does not ask whether the protesters are right or whether there should be a revolution, but simply whether there can be one. With that in mind, let's get into it. In order for scattered and sporadic attacks to turn into a widespread revolutionary movement, we require some level of centralisation and coordination. It is simply not enough for multiple protests to tear down the status quo. There are a number of factors which limit mobilising revolutionaries. People need to know what they are mobilising for. This is dubbed framing. A centralised group controls the agenda setting, framing the movement, defining what the movement is and what it wants. For these frames to be successful in recruiting allies and new members, the frame must resonate with many people. For example, take the Arab Spring. The people in numerous nations rose up against their leaders calling for democracy. There was some level of centralisation within these nations, coordinating protests and arranging a movement. However, we know that of the nations who would rise up during the Arab Spring, not all of the revolutions would be victorious. This leads us onto the complexities of revolutions. For a revolutionary group to be successful, they must address internal as well as external factors. Internal are things such as leadership, coherent framing, strategies chosen, as well as in-group coordination and communication. If a group has poor leaders and doesn't work together while displaying contradictory messages, they are unlikely to get new supporters and make the change that they desire. Now, external factors are issues such as opportunity structures, which basically means the paths that a movement can take to make change. So in practice, a dictatorship is unlikely to simply allow for a mass movement to take place, let alone to even listen to the cause. For democracies, however, this is different. Democracies tend to respond in 3 main ways. They can simply ignore the issue, so long as it is deemed largely unthreatening to the leaders. They can advance counterframes, defining the revolutionaries in a bad way, hoping to delegitimise the movement, deterring the recruitment of more members. And finally we have violence, sending in the soldiers or police with riot gear. For many protesters, the threat of police violence is simply not worth the struggle. They'd rather just stay home. This is exactly what the government and elites want. The less people out demonstrating, the less legitimacy the protesters have. Now, a relatively big question we are yet to address is one of strategy. Are violent protests more effective than non-violent protests? A study by Stephen and Chenoweth looked at major events from 1990 to 2006, comparing violent versus non-violent protest. They discovered that non-violent campaigns achieve success 53% of the time, contrast to just 26% for their violent campaign counterparts. They suggest the reason for this rests on the fact that more peaceful protests enjoy higher levels of domestic legitimacy. People are more willing to mobilise for a just cause. Arguably, more importantly though, is that governments struggle to offer an effective response to peaceful protests. Gene Sharp details the notion of political jiu-jitsu, by which violent government responses to peaceful protest result in more moral support for the protesters. In this way, the police violence is reflected back at them. This tends to be smarter than violent methods, since it takes away government's excuse for violence, while making more people want to join the cause. So, you're probably wondering, how does all of this relate to America? Well, currently we see widespread unrest in many cities. The atmosphere in America is tense. This implies that there is a willingness for people to mobilise for the cause. However, as it stands, these groups rely on informal structures, mainly social media. They lack a united front and centralisation, which allows for better framing, and in turn, more people joining the cause. Without proper framing, people eventually begin to wonder why they're protesting, ultimately failing to realise what they actually want to achieve. More importantly, without centralisation, they cannot respond coherently to government counterframes. Governments do not like mass protests. It challenges their legitimacy to govern. For instance, President Trump is currently justifying his administration's violent response to these protests by framing them as looters and anarchists, designating Antifa as a terror group. Many people will not want to go out and protest and associate with these groups for this very reason, and that's why governments do it. Now, if there was centralisation, they could offer a coherent response to these government frames, potentially insisting on non-violent defiance. When protesters turn violent, they fall into the hands of the elite. It gives them legitimate reason to squash the unrest while deterring potential allies from rising up. For example, as of this video, President Trump is threatening on deploying the military. When an event is too big to ignore, and violence from the police is not working to suppress the movement, the elite will then try to challenge the anger and frustration within their institutions. Democrats tend to successfully channel this kind of anger. Yet, Joe Biden is not as popular as many people had hoped. More so, since Obama seemingly failed to make any meaningful change, for many people, they may begin to lose faith in these methods. This can lead to a willingness for mass unrest. The fact that President Trump is unwilling or unable to calm the protesters, choosing to tweet a series of inflammatory tweets, this may only make things worse. At face value, the tactics his administration are using seem to be counter-framing, calling the protesters looters and anarchists, as well as the use of force, with 16,000 National Guard being deployed across the United States, with further threats of military deployment. To answer our question then, is this going to lead to a revolution? Probably not. Although there are many people willing to mobilise, they are currently fragmented. For the disenfranchised to cause the change that they desire, it requires a series of centralisation and coordination. Otherwise, it is highly likely that these protests will be placed on the shelf as one among many others before it. So unless a centralised group emerges from all of this, it is highly unlikely to result in anything more than a continuation of scattered unrest and the perpetuation of the status quo. As of this video, there is a limited level of coordination between protesters, rendering the chances of a revolution limited at best. Whether this changes in the future is yet to be seen.